Thanks very much indeed for joining us at the event, which is to explore misinformation as a tool of war from a historic and present-day context. Before we get on to that, we're going to be hearing from Amira Mai, the project coordinator of Academi Heddwch Cymru, who's going to give a brief overview of the work of the Academy. We're also privileged to be joined by our two speakers on the topic today. Dr. Tatiana Pawlusz, who's a lecturer in modern European history at Cardiff University, and Alexei Korolev, who's a Russian journalist, and investigative editor with the independent news outlet Meduza. We'll hear from each of the speakers in turn, and you then, the audience, will be able to ask questions via the Q&A function. So if you put any questions you may have into the Q&A, I'll then be able to relay them to our speakers. And you're welcome to ask your question in Welsh. And I should also say that if we don't manage to get round to answering all the questions, we'll be able to catch up with that subsequently via email. So just a few words from me before we come on to the main part of the session. There can hardly, it struck me, be a more apposite topic to discuss at the moment than this one. Faced with a catastrophe, really one that we wouldn't, I don't think, have previously imagined, certainly not in my lifetime, with the catastrophe of a war in Europe in which the aggressor refuses even to call it a war, it's difficult to know where to begin. The origins, development and uses of propaganda are fairly well known and understood, but in recent years I think we've seen a perhaps more sinister and effective use of misinformation, misdirection, outright and repeated lies, and psychological manipulation. We've seen all this become the norm, not only in repressive regimes, but also in Western democracies in ways that we previously wouldn't have countenanced. The advent of social media, AI, deepfake technology, and these kinds of developments have transformed the boundary conditions within which we operate. Misinformation, though, as a tool of war is a specific and insidious manifestation of this, because it's traditionally been used as a very well understood and indeed accepted military strategy and a fundamental element of tactical operations in war. So we're dealing here with quite a specific aspect of a broader subject, I think. So I'm keenly looking forward to listening to our experts on this topic, and I'm sure that we, the audience, will finish the seminar much better informed and with much greater ability to contribute constructively to these debates in our daily lives and work. And I welcome any corrections to anything I've said from both of our speakers, because that was just my view as a non-expert on all of this. Before we come to that, I'm going to ask Amira Mai, project coordinator at the Academy, to give a brief overview of its work. For your information, Amira is going to speak first in Welsh and then in English. So, Amira, over to you.
Diolch yn fawr, pnawn da pawb. Good afternoon, everybody. Fy enw I yw Amira a fi yw cydlynydd Academi Heddwch Cymru. Rydw i'n mynd i fod yn rhoi cyflwyniad byr dwyieithog I chi am Academi Heddwch Gyntaf Cymru. My name is Amira. I'm the coordinator for Academi Heddwch Cymru, and I'm going to be giving you a short bilingual introduction to Wales's first Peace Institute. Roedd creu Academi Heddwch Gyntaf Cymru yn waith 10 mlynedd a mwy o ymgyrchu. Cafodd y syniad ei gynnig gyntaf yn dilyn cynlluniau llywodraeth y DI I breifateiddio ag uno'r holl hyfforddiant milwrol mewn Academi Filwrol Mawr ym Mro Morgannwg. Denodd y syniad am Academi Heddwch gefnogaeth frwd. Lanswyd Academi Heddwch yn swyddogol ar ddiwrnod heddwch rhyngwladol Medi 1/2020 yn dilyn llofnodi memorandwm cyd-dealltwriaeth gan holl brifysgolion Cymru, y Coleg Cymraeg Cenedlaethol, Canolfan Materion Rhyngwladol Cymru a'r Gymdeithas Dysgedig. Dyfarnwyd cyllid iddi gan Lywodraeth Cymru yn 2020 a phynodwyd cydlynydd ym mis Gorffennaf 2021. Erbyn diwrnod heddwch rhyngwladol Medi 2021, roedd yr Academi yn falch iawn o gyhoeddi mae Dr. Owen Williams fyddai ei chydeirydd. The establishment of Wales's first Peace Institute was the culmination of over 10 years of campaigning. The idea was first proposed following UK government plans to privatise and merge all military training at a large military academy in the Vale of Glamorgan. A Welsh Peace Institute was put forward as an alternative, and this idea quickly gathered support. Academy Heddwch was officially launched on World Peace Day, September 21st, 2020, following the signing of a Memorandum of Understanding by all the universities of Wales, the Coleg Cymraeg Cenedlaethol, the Welsh Centre for International Affairs, and the Learned Society. Funding was awarded by the Welsh Government in 2020, and a coordinator, that was me, was appointed in July 2021. By World Peace Day, September 21st, 2021, the Academy was delighted to announce that Dr. Owen Williams would be its chair. Dibyn yr Academi Heddwch yw ymestyn traddodiad cryf Cymru o ran hyrwyddo a gweithio dros heddwch, drwy ddatblygu a chydrefnu cymuned annibynnol o ymchwilwyr mewn meysydd cysylltiedig, bydd yn gweithio i roi heddwch yn gadarn ar yr agenda cenedlaethol. Ar y llwyfan rhyngwladol, bydd yn dod yn rhan o rwydwaith byd eang o sefydliadau heddwch. Yr amcanion cyffredinol yw sicrhau bod Cymru'n gwneud cyfraniad i ymchwil heddwch ag ymarfer heddwch gyda'r ymchwil hwnnw o ansawdd a gaiff ei gydnabod yn rhyngwladol. Bod na ffocws ar heddwch i weld yn strategaethau a pholisïau perthnasol Llywodraeth Cymru, a bod y cyhoedd yn ymddiddori'n fyw yn ymchwil ac ymarfer heddwch yng Nghymru. Academy Heddwch Cymru's aim is to extend Wales's strong tradition of peacemaking and peace promotion by developing and coordinating an independent community of researchers in related fields. Academy Heddwch Cymru will work to place peace firmly on the national agenda. On the international stage, it will become a part of a global network of peace institutes. The overall aims are to ensure that Wales makes an internationally recognised contribution to peace research and practice, that a focus on peace is seen in relevant Welsh Government strategies and policies, and that there is strong public engagement with peace research and practice in Wales. Ond, be mae Academi Heddwch Cymru yn wneud? Wel, yn ystod yn blwyddyn cyntaf, rydym wedi cynnal digwyddiadau ar amrywiol bynciau thematig, enghraifft heddwch a newid yn yr hinsawdd, Cymru fel cenedl noddfa, a chynhadledd amddisgyblaethol ar heddwch ac iechyd. Yn dilyn goresgyniad yr Wcrain, mae Academi Heddwch wedi cynnal 2 ddigwyddiad ar y gwrthdaro mwyn cynyddu dealltwriaeth ac annog trafodaeth wybodus. Ar hyn o bryd, rydym yn cynllunio ei ddigwyddiadau ar gyfer 2023 ac yn ddiweddar rydym ni wedi cyfarfod gyda Chymdeithas Bêl-droed Cymru i helpu ddrafftio datganiad gwerthoedd ar gyfer tîm pêl-droed dynion Cymru o flaen y Cwpan Byd yn Qatar. Yn ogystal i hyn, rydym wedi bod yn paratoi ar gyfer ein digwyddiad ar ferched, heddwch a diogelwch ar wedi'i 9 ar 20. At hyn, rydym yn cydweithio ar prosiect i ddathlu camlwyddiant yr apel merched dros heddwch. Ymgyrch ryfeddol oedd hyn ac anghofwyd i raddau helaeth ac un sy'n llawn heiddi sylw, cenedlaethol a rhyngwladol. But what does Academy Heddwch Cymru do? Well, during our first year, we've hosted thematic events on subjects such as peace and climate change, Wales as a nation of sanctuary, and a multidisciplinary conference on peace and health. Following the invasion of Ukraine, Academy Heddwch has hosted 2 events on the conflict to both increase understanding and encourage informed discussion. We are currently planning our events for 2023, and we recently met with the Football Association Wales to help them draft a value statement for the Wales men's team ahead of the World Cup in Qatar. In addition to this, we're preparing for our event on women, peace and security on September 29th, and we're also working in a partnership to celebrate the centenary of the Women's Peace Petition. This was a remarkable campaign that has largely been forgotten, and it deserves to be brought to national and international attention. Diolch yn fawr iawn. Thank you very much. I will pass back now to our chair.
Diolch yn fawr, Amira. Thank you very much indeed for that. Very interesting outline of the work of the Academy. So we now come to Dr. Tatiana Pavlos' contribution. Tatiana lectures in modern European history here at Cardiff University, and her research explores different aspects of collective memory, national identity, and the politics of history in the German and broader European context. Tatiana is going to discuss the weaponization of history using examples from the past, really. Many thanks for joining us, Tatiana, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to this event. It's my pleasure and honor to speak to the audience of the Wales Peace Academy today. And thank you, Vice Chancellor, for the meaningful introduction. From the university correspondence, and particularly in the first months after the Russian invasion started, I know how deeply you are engaged with various aspects of this topic. Many probably remember how in the first days and weeks after the 24th February, we have been trying to make sense of this new reality that seemed to be surreal. People who followed the news in the media, also journalists and commentators, all seemed to be puzzled by what could be the actual reasons for this unprovoked act of aggression, what could be the aims of this full-scale invasion in Europe. And it was striking how much history mattered in these discussions, not only for understanding the roots of the conflict, but also how history was instrumentalized and weaponized, how references to the historical events from the past, in fact, diverted versions of history, were used by the Kremlin propaganda to justify the war, to dehumanize Ukrainians, and to undermine Ukraine's statehood and national identity. The question of use and misuse of history as part of the warfare became crucial for understanding of this war. The abuse of history in the Russian-Ukrainian war is what I'm going to talk about within the next 15 minutes. The initial plan to conquer Ukraine and the declared aim of denazification was based on a number of wrong and, in fact, barbaric premises, assumptions, and lies. And I will try to confront some of them. The narratives that I will focus on are that Ukrainian nation doesn't exist, that Ukrainian state is not a real state, that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, and that Ukrainians are the Nazis. All these narratives are not new. They were present in the Russian public discourse long time before the war started. But what is new about them is that they have been presented blatantly as a pretext for the war of aggression, for mass murder, and for tremendous destructions that we are now observing online. Let me discuss some of these narratives shortly, and I will start with that Ukrainian nation doesn't exist. In fact, modern European national movement goes back 200 years, and before that there were pre-modern elements of Ukrainian nation. Ukraine has a typical European history. It has the medieval period, conversion to Christianity, early modern period, Renaissance, Reformation, and modern era. And this strong embeddedness of Ukraine in European history also what differentiates Ukraine from Russia, because the historical constellation of various influences was different in Russian history. In this way, the invasion can be also seen as an attack on Ukraine's European identity, Ukraine's European history and aspiration. Another Putin's narrative is that Ukrainian state is not a real state, but is the product of the Bolshevik Revolution or the byproduct of the collapse of the Soviet Empire. Putin claimed that it was Lenin who created Ukraine, and this statement sounds ridiculous to historians because the emergence of the Ukrainian Socialist Soviet Republic in 1922 was not the goodwill of the Bolsheviks, but the acknowledgement of Ukrainian factor and of its importance, of its centrality, in fact, for the project of the USSR. Lenin not created, but reacted to the Ukrainian drive for independence. There were several attempts to create an independent Ukrainian state after the First World War, and they all failed for various reasons. After the Second World War, the Ukrainian insurgent army continued nationalist resistance to the Soviet regime into the 50s, which was significantly longer than any other armed resistance in to the Soviet regime in the Soviet-occupied Central and Eastern Europe. In the national referendum in December 1991, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the turnout reached 84%, with more than 90% of voters supporting independence. This word manifested the end of the Soviet Union. The next myth is that Ukrainians and Russians are one people, Slavic brothers. In an infamous essay on the historical unity of Russia and Ukraine from 2021, Putin claimed that Ukrainians and Russians were historically one nation, and that this unity was later artificially divided, and that this was the result of some external forces. But the whole concept of brotherhood among nations is a nonsense, the same as the idea of some mythical historical unity that should for some reason last forever. This concept of historical unity is ahistorical as such, because as we know, history is about change. In order to support his claim about this unity, Putin and Russian propaganda often made references to the medieval empire, Kievan Rus. Putin calls it, in fact, ancient Rus in his essay, whose descendants both Ukraine and Russia claim to be. And the irony is that Kievan Rus was neither Ukrainian nor Russian. The ancestors of modern Ukrainian and modern Ukrainians and modern Russians lived in multiple pre-modern entities, principalities, kingdoms, and empires. They took various names and identities. The term Rus itself was brought to the region by the Vikings in the 9th and 10th centuries. Interesting enough that while claiming that Russians and Ukrainians are one people, Putin doesn't mean any mythic Slavic nation, of course, neither that Russians are Ukrainians. What he actually means is that Ukrainians are Russians. And this logic demonstrates the imperial thinking in Russia, which underpins this obsession with Ukraine. Without Ukraine, the project of the Russian Empire is not viable. Being the center of Kievan Rus, Kiev is kind of spiritual Jerusalem for the so-called Russian world. Without Kiev, that was also founded 700 years before Moscow emerged on the map, the cornerstone and the very ideological legitimacy of the Russian world would be missing, and thus the whole construct of the great Russian Empire, the so-called historical Russia, would erode. Although it's not entirely clear what historical Russia means, as Russia is a modern nation. Is it Russian Empire or the Soviet Union? What other regions are part of this project? Certainly the Baltic countries, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. But what about Poland or Central Asia or Caucasus? This remains unclear where should be the border of this project. The last narrative to consider is that Ukrainians are Nazis. Initially, this term was used in relation to Ukrainian-speaking population only. But now Russian propaganda interprets any expression of Ukrainian identity or any loyalty to Ukrainian state as, I'm quoting, spiritual heritage of military criminals, fascists, and Nazis, end of quote. Instead of discussing the place and role of nationalism in Ukrainian history, I think it makes more sense to look at how Ukrainian nationalism has been used for propaganda purposes in Russian-Ukrainian history. Ukrainian nationalism was one of the reasons given by Stalin for organizing the Great Famine of 1932-33, the Holodomor, in the course of which more than 3 million people starved to death. This event left traumatic memories for generations of Ukrainians and actually destroyed the nation at that time. Despite all the horrors of the Holodomor, one of the official narratives in the anti-Ukrainian propaganda then, and probably the most outrageous one, was that people were starving themselves and that they are doing it on purpose to discredit the Soviet Union and the communist system. Ukrainian diaspora was trying to inform the world about what was happening, but the Soviet propaganda called them the Nazis. Anyone who was trying to say in 1933 that Ukrainians are starving was called a Nazi. A few years later, Ukrainian nationalism was one of the reasons for the terror in 1937-38. Furthermore, Ukrainian nationalism was one of the reasons given by Stalin for the mass deportations of inhabitants of Soviet Ukraine after the Second World War. In 2014, Ukrainian nationalism was again the reason given for the Russian invasion in eastern Ukraine and for the Crimea annexation operation. Kremlin-backed media called protesters taking part in Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution in 2013-14 as banderovцы, which is the Soviet and Russian generic term for Ukrainian nationalists, presented as Nazi collaborators. And finally, last February, Ukrainian nationalism was again given as a reason for the full-scale invasion. Denazification of Ukraine was declared as the main goal in this war. And for denazification, read the complete and definite destruction of Ukraine's statehood and leaders, the eradication of its national identity, history, and cultural heritage. So I have tried now to engage with some of historical narratives that have been used by Russian propaganda as part of a military and information war in Ukraine, not just in Ukraine, basically in Russia and in the world. I would like to make three concluding remarks now. First, these narratives are not just alternative historical interpretations, but examples of the cynical abuse of history that serves the purpose to justify the war of aggression, the destruction of an independent state and its people to justify mass murder. We should be aware of this dangerous potential of any instrumentalization and weaponization of history that history bears. We shouldn't make history complicit, of course. Secondly, I would like to pose a question here. What is the best strategy to combat such narratives? Is it worth at all exploring and discussing these nonsensical messages? They may sound pathetic, anachronistic, and farcical, but this pathos, though, has its tragic repercussions for Ukrainians, having the cities bombed and their existence threatened. Putin communicates openly to Ukrainians, as well as to his own citizens, that his military liberation of Ukraine will be painful and tough. But he juxtaposes it passionately with all this messianic nonsense. There is war in Ukraine, and war is this war, as any war, is a senseless destruction of innocent people's life. And on the other hand, on the other side, we have this abstract, absurd rhetoric, which has nothing to do with reality. So how to make sense of this gap? Should we bother with refuting these messages? While debunking manipulations of history is important, of course, it also carries certain risks, namely of repeating and reinforcing the agenda and the framing set by the Kremlin. We can hardly debunk all lies of the Russian propaganda anyway. And also the effort of debunking itself suggests that if all these facts were true, then it would be legitimate to use them as a historical justification. But this is fundamentally wrong, because war crimes and atrocities cannot be justified by history, the same as existing state borders do not need any historical justification, because any borders in the world could be potentially contested. Posing the question of whether Ukraine has to be a nation or as a state means a fundamental attack on the international post-war order. And arguing historically is making history complicit in it, in this attack. And my last remark, this obsession with history and with the past in Russia means that Russian elites and intellectuals didn't manage to articulate any alternative version of Russia's future, which would sound more appealing to Russian people, more appealing than these anachronistic, rudimentary imperial concepts. Russia's vision of the future is in the past. And when what we see in this war is that having this idea of returning to the past is dangerous and destructive for the neighboring countries, But what we probably don't see in full yet is how self-destructive it is for Russia and Russian itself. I think I would conclude by this.
Thank you very much indeed, Tatiana. That was really interesting. That was a great point to finish on there is, and something I'm sure we can come back to in the question and answer session, is how effective is this likely to be? It certainly hasn't gone according to plan, which is an interesting one. And we've already got one interesting question in the chat, so please do keep those coming in. And quite a few things have occurred to me as you spoke as well. So let's move on then now to our next speaker, Alexei. Alexei is an award-winning Russian journalist and the investigative editor at the independent news outlet Meduza, as I mentioned early on. He's been working actively to share independent news beyond Russian propaganda for years, so an ideal contributor for us, I think. Alexei's been working in the field of journalism for 19 years and has written for The Guardian, Wired, the New York Times, and the Moscow Times. Alexei will discuss misinformation in Russia and the role that it plays in the current conflict with Ukraine. Thanks very much for agreeing to join us, Alexei, and please, over to you now.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for having me. I am a Russian journalist, and I now live in exile in Riga, and this has something to do with misinformation, and I'll explain why. On February 24, when the full-scale invasion started, this is an important point because both for us Russians and Ukrainians, the war didn't start 6+ months ago. It actually started for both Russia and Ukraine back in April 2014. So I'm going to call it the active phase of the invasion for clarity's sake. So on February 24, when the active military invasion of Russia and Ukraine started, I was still in Moscow because our Meduza, the independent publication I work for, has an office in Riga, Latvia, a country neighboring to Russia. We moved here back then in 2014, 8 years ago, specifically to prevent our offices being raided from any physical harassment by the police. And in the long term, it turned out to be a very sound strategy. So, but all this time I was in Moscow, where I was born and I lived all my life. But on February 24, a few hours after I was woken up at 6 a.m. by a call from my editor, who just said 2 words: "Wake up!" It started. I didn't need any further explanations. I just popped up my laptop and started working. A few hours later, around midday, the Russian, let's call it for what it is. It's a censorship ministry. It's a media watchdog called Roskomnadzor that has the power to block or ban or online news media. And so every online news media in Russia received a letter from the censorship ministry demanding that we do not spread misinformation about the Russian armed forces. And that was the definition of spreading misinformation about the Russian armed forces. That was by using any other source of information other than Russian defense ministry's press releases. You can obviously see the implications of that demand. And one on the top of that list was not referring to the war as war, because what they wanted us to tell our readers is that it's not really a war; it's a special military operation. We obviously couldn't agree to these terms, and we kept on informing our readers about factual developments, because this is a war that Russia started. We cannot call it anything else. So 1 week later, a set of new laws was passed by the Russian parliament, both chambers, the State Duma and the Council of the Federation. So they all convened in an extraordinary session on a Friday, March 4, to pass a new set of laws that formalized that demands by the censorship ministry. Now, it didn't just apply to to a few online media that kept calling the war a war. But also these new laws now guarantee criminal prosecution to anyone who does that, who calls this war a war, or says something online or in public that doesn't agree with the official line that this is a well, you heard from Tatiana what they're saying. Basically, she ran the whole gamut of this Kremlin narrative that there's it's not, you know, I have to note that here I have to point out that in Russia, as of now, there is not a single news media that is available to the Russians, nor a radio station or a newspaper or a website that is not blocked in Russia, and it's also not controlled by the Kremlin in some ways, whether directly by owning it as a state enterprise, or by having it completely submit to the demands of covering the war only from an angle that the Kremlin agrees with. So on March 4, Meduza, as well as all other independent media in Russia, were blocked. So none of them are available in Russia right now. So you have to jump through some extra hoops, like using a VPN or a proxy to access websites that filter misinformation from the Kremlin and tell us and tell the story as it is. It's the practical implications of this are very varied. So on one hand, and it's especially curious to watch them unfold in real time, because the misinformation that Russia employs in this war is not static. It changes almost every day to its opposite. So, for example, in the initial weeks, it was claimed that actually it was just for I think it only this narrative only held together for 1 week, after which it became increasingly clear that it's unsustainable. It was that Russia is just attacking the Nazi usurpers in Kiev. It doesn't have any qualms with the rest of the Ukrainian nation. So it just wants to remove, and it actually in the announcement that Vladimir Putin made on the TV on February 24, he addressed the members of the Ukrainian armed forces, asking them to overthrow their Nazi usurpers in Kiev. And that was the line that the Russian television delivered, that we're not waging a war against Ukrainians. No one's really saying that word war. We're just conducting a special military operation to remove the Nazi elements from Kiev, and the Ukrainian population will be greeting us as liberators. Then it became quite abundantly clear that this is not happening. Then the propaganda changed their tune again to something equally morose. But it doesn't mean that people were scratching their heads and saying, "Oh wow, they were saying one thing yesterday and they're saying a completely different thing today. Maybe something is not right there. Maybe we shouldn't believe them." But no, in practical terms, I found that quite plausible a theory offered by some academics. There are some academic studies about China and Syria that propaganda and misinformation don't have to be convincing, because that is not really the point. If it's absurd and self-contradictory, that is in fact the point, because there's a theory of propaganda and misinformation as signaling, because they're not asking you to subscribe to a certain narrative, to a certain set of beliefs, and it's actually it's even more effective if these narratives are changing every single day to their opposite, because what they're doing, in fact, what the point of this is, it's a tool of bonding. It's a rallying point, and it's also a way for the state to show its omnipresence, because it's it's psychologically, I know it from my own personal empirical experience, that no matter how absurd and self-contradictory these propaganda messages are, they are also quite pervasive. So what the government is telling you is not really the content that they deliver. It's not the content, but the form. What they are asking you to do is not believe that there is a Nazi junta in Kiev, but believe whatever. Just stick with us, because with us you are part of a community that believes these things. And if you refuse to do so, you're an outcast, and you're actually risking. And if you actually say that out loud, the things that you're thinking, you are risking a jail term of 5 to 7 and maybe 10 years. So it's very powerful, and it's terrifyingly effective. Because in 2015, I launched a website that was called the Noodle Remover. In Russian, there is a very graphic expression: to put noodles on someone's ears means to lie, to deceive them. And for a few years, I realized in 2015, just as the first phase of the Russia-Ukraine war started, that there wasn't a single fact-checking effort in the Russian media. And so I was attempting to show how much basically fake news is out there, and how much straight up lies or distortions the Russian state television state media are using to justify this war. But then it occurred to me that it takes an immense amount of effort to actually convince someone that it's really not like that. It's really not what they're telling you on television. Because if it was just about showing the person the correct facts, how things really are, and they would just say, "Oh yeah, I was fooled by this misinformation. I'll straight up my thinking now." It never works like that, really. And one of the most depressing and terrifying effects of these flood of misinformation on Russian state media is that people under the influence of these state-sponsored misinformation, which works as a tool, as a rallying point for the government, is that it's so difficult for an individual to accept in their own mind that they have been wrong this whole time, that it's nearly impossible, because there's a very widely discussed phenomenon in Russia, because Ukrainians and Russians have family ties. So do I, for example, and Ukrainian members of thousands of Russian families on the other side of the border, they tried calling their relatives and telling them Russian artillery is destroying our cities. A Russian shell just killed your aunt in Kiev. And their Russian relatives on the other end were saying, no, this couldn't be happening, because they were hearing on television that Russian military is only striking military targets as part of the special military operation. So what you're telling me, so your empirical experience is irrelevant to me, because I chose to believe this, because I want to be, for my own personal comfort, I want to be part of this community that believes in these things, even if I do understand that they might not be true. So in Russia, misinformation is not just something. It's not just some kind of distorted facts that you can counter with fact checking. It is actually it's something that destroys thousands of families, that rips them apart. So I don't really have an answer, because in practical terms, I found that it is possible to change someone's mind. But it's going to take you many hours, and also a bond of trust between yourself and someone you plan to convince otherwise. So it is possible, but it takes so much effort that it's really impractical, especially if the person does in the end agree that yes, in fact, that he's been believing in a lie, and he's been fooled, and no, it's not really a special military operation, it's a war that Russia is waging against Ukraine with the aim of completely erasing its nationhood. So it is possible to convince a person to accept that. But the next day they turn on the television and it's all your efforts are gone. So I don't really have an answer to a question how can anyone actually counter this? But I know that for a while it's nearly impossible, especially to do on a national level. I've been talking to to a member to an employee in a Russian propaganda machine, and I'm really curious about how that mind works, because in the past week a very interesting development happened. There was a break. I'm sure you've all heard that there was a major breakthrough, that Ukraine liberated a big chunk of its territory. And again, one of the tragic implications of Russian misinformation were people who believed in those lies, who were abject lies. There was no reason to believe at all the Russian officials who came to the occupied parts of Ukraine, and they were telling, there's a propaganda slogan, actually a few of them. So one of them is it's very popular. It was on billboards in the occupied territories. One of them says Russia doesn't leave Russia doesn't leave her own behind. And the other was there was actually a video circulating on social media. It was on billboard that the Ukrainian soldiers were ripping down. It says, "Russia is here to stay." So 42. I think it was in June. A Russian state official came to the occupied parts of the Kharkiv region, and he told a crowd of civilians that Russia is here to stay, and you have to believe us. Come to our side, be Russians, take up Russian passports, speak Russian, because we don't leave our own behind. 42 days later, the Russian troops abandoned, just ran away, abandoning behind all their heavy armor, and those people who believed in their lies. That is very tragic, because thousands of people who took a job in the occupation administration and helped the occupation anyway, they are in very serious legal trouble now, because they were aiding an aggressor who told them abject lies. There was no ground to believe in them at all. Who would believe the Russian propaganda, because all they do is just lie all the time. And hopefully that will be hopefully that experience will transcend the borders of the liberated Kharkiv Oblast. Hopefully that will be a lesson to the people in other occupied areas, that you shouldn't really believe anything Russia's saying, because it adopted lies and misinformation as kind of a status quo in a world where where nothing is true, because whenever a Russian official is accused of lies, his or hers, their response will always be, so what? So United States also tells lies, and everyone tells lies. Actually, there is no truth at all. So you may choose to believe me or not, but you should be aware that there is no truth at all. But it's also quite curious to watch the people spreading this misinformation, getting high on their own supply, so to say, to finally be forced to confront the reality. So when that incredible rout by Ukrainian armed forces happened in the Kharkiv region, the same people who for the past 6 months have been telling their audience, all of the pro-Kremlin bloggers and media, they were telling them the same thing, that Ukrainians are fleeing, that there is no more Ukraine. There's just some leftover rump state that we're going to tolerate, but otherwise the Ukrainians are just Russians. It's just a little misunderstanding. So we're just so this part of Russia that is for the past 30 years has been some kind of pseudo country. We're just removing that confusion. So and it's going smoothly. You'll never hear about any if you are only consuming Russian state television for the past 6 months, you wouldn't know that things aren't really going as smoothly. And now the same people who have been telling their audience these lies, they are in real time, they are forced to confront the terrible truth that you cannot hide anymore. That no, Russia is not really winning in Ukraine. In fact, it's losing terribly. And some of these people are just simply refusing to acknowledge this simple fact. So I had as I said, I had a very interesting conversation with a member of Russian government propaganda. And when I told her, do you realize, it's not an interview, it's not on record, but could you just tell me personally, do you accept that everything you've been telling other people, and you probably believed yourself, is not true? So what are there? So why do you think this is happening? Do you have any feelings about it? And she just went on some kind of not very coherent rant about it's NATO is to blame for this war, or NATO is supplying these Ukrainians with arms. So yeah, this is. But she simply, when I asked her to tell me one simple thing, Russia is losing in this in the Kharkiv region. She just refused. She just flat out refused to acknowledge this fact. It's probably going to take us some time to come to terms with this. But for other people, I think I cannot say for sure. But for some people, it only takes a terrible tragedy to acknowledge that everything they've been believing to, that they've been fed misinformation. For example, one of the fathers of the conscripts who died on the Moskva, sunk by the Ukrainian armed forces, and it was there were several hundred conscripts. Who aren't really supposed to be there, because Russia is not, by its own laws, Russia is not allowed to use conscripts in something that it refuses to call a war, where Russia is formally not in a state of war, so it cannot use its actual army of conscripts to fight in Ukraine. But of course it did many times. So one of these several hundreds of those conscripts died on the Moskva, which the Russian Defense Ministry simply refused to acknowledge. It's still several months later. It refuses to acknowledge that it was sunk by the Ukrainian armed forces. But one of the fathers of the sailors who died on the Moskva, he was a very eager supporter of this special military operation. And it took him a terrible tragedy of losing his son and then several weeks to finally come to terms to this terrible fact. He went through all the stages of grief and denial online, and he was posting all his experiences on his social media. But then several weeks later, he just kind of exploded. He said, I had been believing all those lies, but now my eyes are open. So on one hand, that's how much it takes to dispel misinformation. That's how destructive it is. But on the other, it only takes a turning point like the Ukrainian route in the Kharkiv Oblast, for many people under the spell of this disinformation, the dissonance between what you've been believing in and the facts staring in your face at some point becomes just too intolerable. And I can see that in many people who have been very avid supporters of Putin's war, and they're not really that many of them, because realistically, I would say that 60 to 70% of all of Russia's general population doesn't really care either way, because yes, sure, they will answer a question in a poll: do you support the special military operation in Ukraine? Of course, they will say whatever, yes, please, just leave me alone. But then the next question is, would you support Vladimir Putin if he decided to sue for peace and end the special military operation in Ukraine? The same amount of people says yes, we don't mind. So whichever way. So I would say there are about 10 to 15% of active anti-war, of people who are actively anti-war, and then about the same amount of people who are actively pro-war. So the most interesting development is in the pro-war camp. So when these people are finally confronted with something that they cannot deny or ignore, they are looking for, as a way out of this terrible cognitive dissonance, they are looking for scapegoats. And right now, for quite a sizable portion of these people, the solution was to blame the Kremlin. And actually, I wrote a piece for the Foreign Policy magazine about this phenomenon. And many of the people in the there is now a segment of the it's not really that big, but they do command a sizable media resource. They have Telegram channels with hundreds of thousands of subscribers, and they are now trying to explain their way out of this situation that they ended up in. They started blaming the Kremlin for. First, they started blaming the Russian Defense Ministry for being so incompetent. And then the next logical step in this is to blame the Kremlin, because it's the Vladimir Putin who appoints the Defense Ministry. So I'm going to end here because I kind of tied myself in a knot. So please, I'm going to accept some questions now.
That's great. Thanks very much indeed, Alexei. Really fascinating to get your perspective there. And we do have some questions in the chat. I had one or two questions myself, but rather than being the usual chair, I'm going to go actually straight to the chat to make sure that we deal with ones from the audience. And if there's time, we'll come back to some thoughts that I had. So. They're not all quite questions. There's one or two that are more like comments, but there is one here on the first one from Joe Boyle there on whether what's the role of academia, in particular state of humanities, politics and international relations studies in Russia's higher education. I think we realise they're going to be subject to the same laws as anybody else on all of this. So the question is there dissent and free thinking, or does academia simply provide the ballast for Putin's historical fantasies and misinformation? Tatiana, do you want to make a start on that one?
Yeah, I think maybe Alexei provides more insights from inside the Russian society. I will then try to provide the comments on this then as well.
Alexei?
I'm not a member of the academia. From what I know, academia cannot really thrive in an environment where you're not allowed to call a war. So I think the answer is obvious. And most of the most of the self-respecting academics in Russia have already quit their universities, and most of them have left Russia. So I would say that from my very my layman's point of view is that Russian academia is in deep decline, because even when it's not even outside of humanities, in STEM, you are it's you know, how can you advance your field of studies when you're in, when there's basically a very unpredictable set of off-limit topics, whether it's in physics or whatever. You cannot really it's you know, science doesn't really work like that. If you're not allowed to touch certain, even if it doesn't really have anything to do with your particular field of study, the environment itself is not conducive. Yes, there you know, there's obviously dissent and free thinking in Russian academia, but everyone who's free thinking is has already left Russia, but by this point, I would say so. Yeah.
Essentially, there isn't the scope for that now within Russia anymore, is there? Tatiana, the next. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I could just shortly add to this that I have heard the first appeals from some Russian academics working abroad to decolonize some fields of Eastern European, Russian, Soviet studies and Slavistics. For instance, Marina Mogilner, it's a Russian historian who works in Chicago. He talks about it in the Slavic Review. And so there is this idea of that Russian history, culture, literature should be, we should create the opportunity, there should be an opportunity to critically rethink some aspects of the past. And yeah, so I think probably, but there are just a few voices that I heard about this. Otherwise, from Russia, I hardly hear any very critical and self-reflexive analysis with regard to what is going on. And on the contrary, I very often hear from even from people who consider themselves or present themselves as liberals, these elements of imperial thinking, and very often it's kind of particularly if you listen to what they have discussed in the interviews on Echo Moskvy, for instance, a few months ago or half a year ago, it can be, I'm exaggerating probably, but I understand, I hear it as, yes, we should somehow destroy Ukraine, we should somehow restore Great Russia, but we should do it in a good way. So this is the message, how I understand and hear it.
Absolutely, which clearly is not bear any relation to what's actually going on. I think the next point there is more, I suppose it implies a question as to what the solution may be, but I think perhaps we could hold that one for Mary Hyman and come back to it and talk about solutions, political solutions in a sense, which there will have to be at some point. You know, I mean, all wars end in some form of political solution, whether it's the complete defeat of one side or whatever happens. Well, let's deal with it now. Let's stick to the order, actually. So the question is, do you agree that regional stability could be guaranteed by accommodating both Ukraine's right to its sovereignty and Russia's long-standing wish for a buffer zone between it and NATO? I mean, it occurs to me that if Russia occupied Ukraine and took it over, there wouldn't be a buffer zone. You'd be right, you know, to reduce the buffer zone. But who would like to tackle that one?
I'm not really big on geopolitics, and but it seems to me that again, Putin's one of the claims that actually it's not a single central claim. But one of the claims that one of the justifications for this war would be to kind of ward off the NATO's advances on Russia, because creeping enlargement on NATO, which is of course kind of creating some kind of buffer zone between Russia and NATO, but quite the opposite, because there are two new NATO members on Russia's borders, which there weren't be if not for this war. So whatever you have to keep in mind that whatever Putin says about, we need a buffer zone between us and NATO for stability, it doesn't really matter, because none of these is, the biggest mistake it can do is take anything he says for face value, because he's a misinformer in chief. He said many times and conveyed the same message through his loyal media that you shouldn't believe him or anyone else, because everyone, there's no one is ever saying the truth. And if you're actually, that's they're saying that out. They're saying the quiet part out loud. That basically, yes, we are lying to you, but that's for the greater good. So whatever he says about Russia's legitimate security concerns, he doesn't really mean that. So a great mistake would be to act on his words as if they mean something, as if they have some kind of a achievable goal. So he asks for 100 of something. We want to give him 0, but let's meet him halfway and give him 50. It doesn't really work like that, because he doesn't really mean that. The goal of you have to be completely clear about what the goal of this is, because actually, if you listen, if you don't really, it doesn't really warrant journalistic investigation, because he's been saying that for years. Actually, he doesn't believe that Ukraine is a real country. So it's really not about NATO or buffers or anything on security concerns. Putin doesn't believe that Ukraine should exist as a country, because he doesn't believe it is one. So he doesn't believe in its nationhood, or that Ukrainians are people separate from Russians. So whatever anything else is secondary. Whether Russia does or doesn't really have legitimate security concerns, it's irrelevant, because the overarching goal of Russia's war is to destroy Ukraine. That's it.
And I think that's, Tatiana, that was really your point, wasn't it? That all these excuses about Ukraine actually being, sort of Nazis and so on, is all part of a myth-making in order to eradicate the notion of nationhood. And that would apply just as well to Estonia and Latvia and other countries too.
Yes, absolutely. Talking about the buffer zone, it means to acknowledge that there were some threats for Russia, but there was none. And even Putin doesn't believe that there were any threat, it's clear. So he doesn't want any buffer zone, and this is hard to present as a point for negotiation. But again, for Ukraine, there is a lot of discussions in Ukraine right now. What is victory? How victory could look like for Ukraine potentially, and some key issues which are discussed there is that the full territorial integrity should be restored, and of course sovereignty should be preserved. But also the question of reparation, war crimes, accountability has been also discussed, the same as some real guarantees. So these are the interests of Ukraine. I cannot accommodate the idea of a buffer zone somehow within this vision of post-war reconstruction from the Ukrainian point of view. And also, I generally think is this post-war reconstruction, but also coming to terms with this trauma, with all losses. This will be a huge task, and this actually will be the victory if Ukraine somehow comes to terms with this in the future. Because as we know from post-war history, survival of the war is one thing, but survival of the peace is another. And many challenges are still coming, and Ukrainian people will need to come to normality somehow, to learn to live with this knowledge and with this experience of mass graves, tortures, loss of family members. This is a huge task, and so every time I hear about future plans and what victory could be, I always think about how the nation will come to terms with this. But of course, first of all, the war needs to be stopped, and the question of how this post-war order in this part of Europe will look like depends on how will the Russian defeat look like. And this is the big question, because we know that defeat can be can look differently. We know it from German history, how it was after the First or after the Second World War. We know how unrealistic is that Russia, it will be like unconditional surrender as it was in case of Germany after the Second World War. So, but depending on whether Russia will defeat, whether it will acknowledge that it has defeated. So I think from this outcome will depend also the rest.
What's absolutely clear is that Putin's invasion plan has not gone according to plan at all, and things are really not going the way that he has expected. So strategically, it isn't working out. We can perhaps come on to talk about that, but I want to try and make some progress with some more questions. I think that the next one, an anonymous one, can a population be deprogrammed after being exposed to a narrative like Putin, similar to de-radicalization of individuals who follow an extremist narrative? Interesting question, because I mean we've had an example in this country of a failed attempt at de-radicalizing an individual who then went on to commit an act of terrorism and murder. And you know, the attempts at denazification of the German population in the post-war period by the Allies had very, very mixed success. There's a story that Billy Wilder told. He directed a film called Die Todesmühlen, the Death Mills, which was about the camps, the Auschwitz and the other the sites of murder. And the film was shown in German cinemas, and the population was invited in, and they were given a survey to complete and pencils to complete it with. And Billy Wilder was asked, you know, what the outcome of that was, and he said, well, they stole the pencils. You know, it's not an easy thing to do, but I'd be very interested to hear what your thoughts are on this. Is it possible to, as it were, undo the misinformation subsequently? Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, it is possible, and I've had some mixed success in this, but like I said, it takes an immense amount of effort, and the success is not guaranteed. So it basically works like you're overwhelming someone with verifiable facts. So it also helps if you can tie them to a chair, so they can't escape. But it isn't possible. So through a sustained and relentless effort, you can convince a person, especially if you have some kind of bond of trust with them, if they're your friend or a relative. It is possible. It is possible to convince a person otherwise. But look, the end of censorship in the Soviet Union actually predates the fall of the Soviet Union. So the act that abolished censorship in the Soviet Union was signed, I think, a year before 1991. I think it was August 1990. And the people who have been deprived for several generations, they have been deprived of any alternative source of information. They have been suddenly exposed to a deluge of information of all different kinds of it, and for many of them, quite a few of them, it was overwhelming, because it brings you comfort knowing that even if something is not true, but you're believing something as a crowd, it brings you psychological comfort. And actually, I found that basically, if you turn off the Russian state television now, in a few weeks, it'll be much easier, because like I said, if this study is about propaganda and misinformation as signaling is true, so when you turn off that signal, the bonding effect of it this probably dissipates. We'll have to see that if that works in practice. But what I found the most frustrating is that, but I do understand why this is happening. When I'm telling people, I investigate, my job is to investigate, basically document war crimes. But I've come to terms that my work will probably never have the immediate effect of convincing someone or a large group of people or one person, if they don't believe that already, that this is a terrible war of aggression and Russian soldiers are committing terrible war crimes. Here, look, we saw it. Here's a very detailed article, exhaustingly covering a single war crime from every possible angle. Here, look at this. No, it doesn't really work like that. It doesn't really work if you just send someone a link and they will immediately wake up and say, oh, we've been told lies all these terrible months. It doesn't really work like that. It hasn't worked with a single person. I tried many times, believe me.
It's very like the conspiracy theory approach.
Yeah, because it's not just about, it's not just about convincing a person of something. What you're asking them to do is to admit that they're part of it, that they're part of a terrible war crimes. Just try to be empathetic to that person and think, would you have admitted that you were part of a major historical war crime? Do you have the do you have it in yourself to admit that? So yeah, it's not just about reconfiguring or deprogramming people. So it's but it's sometimes it's just it really helps if we could just turn the switch on the Russian state television and then start the deprogramming in a few weeks when because it's very toxic and it's very it sticks to you because it's very hard. It's a sense of it gives you a sense of belonging, of community, and it's actually quite hard and most of the times impossible to willfully extract yourself from a community, make yourself an outcast. Not a lot of people can do that.
Thanks. Titania, any thoughts on that? Or indeed, there's another question, the next one, which is whether citizens can act against misinformation. But yeah, go ahead.
Very, very short comment. I think there should be, we hope that there will be enough intellectuals or public figures in Russia at some point who, people like Karl Popper, Thomas Mann, or Karl Jaspers in Germany, in post-war Germany, who will be opening this debate about, who will talk and will encourage this debate to talk about the collective responsibility, and who will have enough authority as well to be heard and to be listened to. But also, I think to make it possible, of course, there should be the change of the regime and the collapse. Otherwise, apparently, this will not happen.
Yeah. But also in the absence of a national reckoning, which is let's be realistic. It's quite unlikely that will happen. Also, the opposite. I can see it actually happening right now, because. When confronted with the fact that you've believed in a terrible lie, a more natural response, as I see it right now, is find a scapegoat and blame them for your own failures. And that is why I think there's what I can see right now unfolding in front of my eyes is the version of the stab in the back myth in the interwar Germany. When many Germans believed that Germany didn't really lose the World War I. It was it was lost through not just actually German military was superior in the World War I, and it only lost because of some domestic enemies like Jews and communists were undermining its war effort. The same thing, literally the same thing is happening in Russia right now.
Absolutely.
And actually. It's quite possible that whoever comes after Putin will be much worse, because these people, these people who are blaming him for losing Kharkiv, the Kharkiv region, these are now they are the opposition to Putin, but they are much worse than him.
Yeah.
It's very interesting historical parallel, Alexei, because I think it really works here indeed, because the battle lines also in the First World War were located in Belgium and France, and the German Reich remained virtually uninvaded, so providing no proof of defeat to German citizens. And then German people who thought their armies were on the brink of victory awoke to the armistice. the acknowledgement of defeat came as a bombshell, and just they were completely unprepared for it. And facing this reality was indeed painful, and nobody helped them to come to terms with this. On the contrary, the politicians supported this myth. And when the German troops were returning from the home to Berlin, then the German Chancellor Friedrich Ebert hailed them at the Brandenburger Tor in Berlin, asserting that they returned unconquered from the battlefield, and nobody contradicted him. It created kind of vacuum of information, which made this myth of the Dolchstoß legend, the myth, the stepped in the back myth, possible at all.
Absolutely. So, you know, some quite worrying warnings from history there, because we all know where that actually led to. There's an interesting question from Toby Charlton on there of whether, I think it's Putin really, does he have an exit strategy, a media exit strategy? I mean, if, you know, there has to be a point surely at which the, you know, that the defeats or failure to achieve any objective becomes impossible to maintain that this is working, I guess. Mm-hmm. What would the exit strategy be?
To declare whatever as victory, and but they can just, you know, it doesn't really matter what they say, because it's, as I said, it's not the content of the message, it's the ubiquity of it. So no matter how absurd, you know, it's increasingly looking that Russia is indeed losing this war, and they will have to retreat from not just the Kharkiv Oblast, but quite possibly from Kherson soon. So they definitely will have to come up. So the explanation. So look at this. A real practical example from just a few days ago. So Russia loses the Kharkiv Oblast, and to explain it, the propaganda now is claiming that it's not. It wasn't really Ukrainians who took over, who liberated the Kharkiv Oblast. It was the NATO and Western mercenaries, and it wasn't really a retreat. It was a tactical feint. Yeah. So Russia didn't really withdraw from the Kharkiv region. It just conducted a tactical regrouping. So it doesn't really, like I said, it doesn't really matter how absurd and self-contradictory these claims are. It only matters that they are blasted from every possible source of information, where it's blogs or social media or state television, and most people in Russia don't really have any other sources of information other than television. So an exit strategy is not so much as an exit strategy, because it doesn't really have to be convincing, you know. So they are, as long as they have total 100% control over all media sources, they can really claim whatever. And as soon as they lose it, it doesn't really matter what kind of exit strategy they have. Because who's going to care if the Kremlin does lose a grain of control over the media that it has right now? At this point, it won't really matter.
And of course, the danger is that the story then becomes, this is Western aggression.
Sure. I can assure you that they will find a way to blame this on the West or whoever.
And the issue then is, you know, the escalation that might follow. There's another question. Tatiana, did you want to come in on that point that we just had?
No.
No. Okay. So there's another question now, again from Joe Boyle, which is, well, this is about the, you know, one thing that this war has done is really exposed the weakness of the Russian military, I think. I mean, that's pretty obvious. I mean, even a non-expert can see that they've made some pretty dramatic strategic errors and operational errors and so on. And Joe is saying there that the Russian military chain of command has based itself on self-misinforming, a culture of lying about, you know, is that a danger? I mean, from what you're saying, Alexei, it isn't really, because you just cover it up and you keep, or is it?
Okay, this is my favorite. Yes, sure. This is I know from my personal experience, because I've been, I've been working as a journalist for 20 years, just as long as Putin has been president, and I know that he's drinking his own Kool-Aid. I mean, he's repeated, he's many times on many occasions he repeated the same widely debunked claims about anything. I mean, it's really whether it's about human evolution or geopolitics or whatever. He can one day his television makes a ridiculous claim, it's debunked by independent media, and a few days later at a press conference, Putin repeats the same idiotic claim, word for word. So it's clear what it's coming from. Here in this case, this is it's quite ironic that, and we know for a fact that this war was, it was the job of the FSB, basically, to prepare the ground for the invasion, and they sold Putin on a complete lie, and he believed in it, and it was evident from the practical moves in the first days and weeks of the war, that they earnestly believed that the Ukrainians were going to greet them as liberators. They sent units in the first weeks of the war when they expected to swiftly take over Kiev. They sent units that they usually send on a parade on a Red Square, because they were actually expecting to hold the victory parade in downtown Kiev on February 27. On February 26, the Russian state media, state news agency RIA Novosti, they published, and then a few hours later deleted, an op-ed congratulating Putin on uniting all the Russian territories, and I'm quoting, I'm not making this up. So they congratulated Putin on solving the Ukrainian question once and for all. They actually said that out loud. Yeah, they said that part out loud. A few hours later, when it because at this point it was very abundantly clear that they're not taking over Kiev in 3 days, so they deleted it. This article, thankfully, it's archived for you can see it online in the web archive. But I think they did, it's quite obvious that they did really believe that this is how the war was going to go. So they roll in with their parade units, in their parade uniforms. The Ukrainian army lays down their arms. Zelensky flees to Poland, because that was in fact the only scenario they were preparing for.
Yeah. Absolutely. So there has been, I guess the bigger question is, and I think that was a really good question to put about the Russian military. Is this whole strategy doomed to fail or is it backfiring very badly? Because, to what extent can misinformation really make up for a failure so dramatic? I mean, Tatiana, what do you think about that?
Yes, it looks like as if Russia got trapped, or Kremlin in their own propaganda, by believing in their own propaganda eventually, but we all are benefiting from this, of course. The way in the chat as well, a few questions about truth, about how can we protect the truth. And I think this is really essential question here, because I think Alexei mentioned this before, but what I have also learned from scholars working on the logic of the Russian propaganda, on the Russian narrative, and the effectiveness of its propaganda in the West as well, is that Putin's propaganda attacks the West for lying all the time. So this all aboutism logic. So the Putin and Russia, in the rhetoric, they admit that they are lying, but they present it as being honest, that we are not hypocrite because we are always evil, and we admit it, while the West pretends to have values and pretends to believe in the existence of truth. And pretends to care about democracy, while we know that this all is lie. So this logic appears tempting for so many people, also in the West. And this is particularly tempting if you are postmodernist and if you are leftist, because we have been used to challenge the truth, to question everything, almost believing there is not such a thing as a universal truth, which is actually true. But the idea that this is all a lie is very seductive. What we can do by protecting the truth is just returning to believe, to this faith in truth, and to believe in universal values, and just identify this nihilism and cynicism in all this rhetoric, in these narratives. And just remember, we should remember that history is about people, about people's agency, and not about structures, big ideas, and geopolitics. And it is so valuable that Alexis said, I don't care about geopolitics. I wish all Russian journalists wouldn't care about geopolitics, but just about fact-checking. And so this is the road, I think, to go to protect the truth.
Yeah, a very good point there about postmodernism and questioning the whole notion that there can be any universal human values, as it were. Alexei, yeah.
Yeah, so very quickly back to Joe Boyle's question. Also, yes, of course, there's a culture of selling up the chain of commands, and it doesn't just apply to military. Because I have sources in Russian government ministries, and it's pretty much the same thing everywhere. You only tell your superiors what you think they expect from you. So it's pretty much the same everywhere, and the practical implication of this culture is very much evident right now with the Russia's failures, because all this time, all these privates to captains to majors to generals, they've been telling each other lies, and the generals have been selling these lies to all the way upwards to Putin. And because we know for a fact that he doesn't really, he's trapped in his own information bubble. He doesn't use the internet, and he only watches his the television that he controls. And he is so paranoid that he's locked himself up in a bunker, and his own Minister of Defense has to sit on at a 100-yard table across from him. So how do you think? Obviously, he's been, these lies and misinformation and fabrications about Russia's imaginary successes, they all filter up all the way to the top, and the man at the top has no alternative sources at all. He only, I know this. Because I actually used to work in I have many insiders in Russian government ministries, and that's really how it works. They just all the information, everything that Putin knows about the world is it comes from these handouts, printed out handouts that his aides give him, and they know that they for many different reasons they avoid giving him passing on any information to him that might upset him.
It's the absolute classic weakness of dictators that they're unable to, people are too scared to tell them the reality, and therefore they end up making bad decisions. Yeah. Well, we pretty much have run out of time, actually, but what a fascinating discussion that was, and how privileged we are to have such acute insights from people who are much closer to this than most of us are. I think there's some reason for hope, I think, because one issue that you do encounter, that we've just been talking about now, is that if you live by the sword of misinformation, you can very much die by the sword of misinformation as well. So it is a two-edged sword. And I guess the other point is that really the West has to get its act together in terms of rebuilding trust with its own electorate, its own populations, because that loss of trust in our system, which we do see happening in various democracies, and challenges to the veracity of politicians, is certainly isn't helpful. I mean, there are so many other areas we could roam into on that topic, but I think we do have to call it a day now, because we said we'd finished by 2 o'clock, and it's 1 minute to. So Just some very big thank yous. Thank you very much indeed to the Academy Heddwch Cymru for putting on this this event, which I have found absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure the audience have too. Thank you to the audience for attending. And above all, thank you very much, Tatiana and Alexei, for contributing. It was really interesting. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
That's it. Bye-bye, everybody.
Thank you.
Diolch yn fawr iawn.